In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and in that war, nightmares take forms that defy comprehension. But among all the horrors that the galaxy can conjure, few scenarios are as strange, as brutal, or as utterly transformative as the tale of a human child raised among the most savage species in the known universe, the Orks. Picture, if you will, a small human infant, perhaps no more than a year or two old, lost in the smoking ruins of what was once a thriving imperial world. The sky above is choked with ash and debris, the remnants of orbital bombardment mixing with the acrid smoke of burning promethium. In the distance, the roar of crude engines and the thunderous battle cries of greenskin warriors echo across the devastation. This child, barely able to walk, barely able to comprehend the catastrophe that has befallen their world, will not grow up reciting the imperial creed. They will not learn the teachings of the ecclesiarchy or pledge their life to the God-Emperor of mankind. Instead, their formative years will be shaped by the most unlikely of surrogate families, a warband of Orks. This is not a story of heroism. It is not a tale of salvation or redemption. It is something far stranger and far more disturbing. It is the story of what happens when the most adaptable species in the galaxy, humanity, is forced to adapt to the most brutal and unforgiving culture imaginable. It is a journey into a world where might makes right, where violence is not just accepted but celebrated, and where the very concept of civilization as we understand it has been replaced by something primal, something savage, something fundamentally alien to human understanding. The Orks, or greenskins as they are sometimes called, are not merely another xenos species to be catalogued and avoided. They are a galactic plague, a green tide that sweeps across worlds with unstoppable momentum. Born from spores, growing larger and stronger with each victory, driven by an instinctive need for violence and conflict, the Orks represent everything that the Imperium stands against. They are anarchic, where humanity seeks order, primitive, where humanity embraces technology, and joyfully barbaric, where humanity attempts to maintain civilization. Yet despite their apparent simplicity, Ork society is far more complex than most imperial citizens realize. They have their own culture, their own beliefs, their own twisted sense of honor and hierarchy, and they worship twin gods of violence and cunning. They organize themselves into vast tribal confederations. They possess an innate understanding of technology that borders on the supernatural, their belief in their ramshackle weapons and vehicles, literally making them work through some strange gestalt psychic field that permeates their entire species. For a human child to grow up in this environment is to be fundamentally reshaped, body and soul. It is to learn a language that consists of guttural roars and crude approximations of Imperial Gothic. It is to navigate a social hierarchy based entirely on physical size and capacity for violence. It is to witness acts of brutality that would break the mind of an adult, yet somehow, impossibly, survive and even thrive. The human capacity for adaptation, for learning, for survival against all odds, is perhaps never more starkly demonstrated than in this most extreme of circumstances. But what does this transformation look like? How does a human child, barely out of infancy, learn to communicate with beings who see conversation as merely a prelude to violence? How do they survive in a society where the weak are culled without mercy, where compassion is viewed as weakness, and where every day is a battle for survival? How do they reconcile their human nature with the savage culture that surrounds them? And perhaps most disturbingly, what becomes of them when, years later, they finally encounter other humans again? These are the questions we must explore as we delve into one of the most unsettling scenarios in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. We will examine not just the physical challenges of surviving among Orks, but the psychological and cultural transformation that such an upbringing would entail. We will look at historical examples from the lore, particularly the phenomenon known as the Digonobs, humans who have not merely survived among Orks, but have come to identify with them, to emulate them, to in some sense become them. This is a journey into the darkest corners of the 41st millennium, where the line between human and xenos becomes blurred, where the very concept of humanity is tested to its limits. It is a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about nature versus nurture, about what makes us human, and about whether our species' greatest strength, our adaptability, might also be our greatest weakness. So prepare yourself. What follows is not for the faint of heart. It is a deep dive into brutality, into savage culture, into a world where every instinct we hold dear must be abandoned simply to survive another day. It is the story of what it truly means to be raised by orcs in the grim darkness of the far future. How could a human child possibly end up in the care of orcs? The very notion seems absurd at first glance. Orcs are not known for their mercy or their paternal instincts. They are warriors born and bred, creatures who live only for the fight, who reproduce through spores scattered across battlefields, who view weakness with nothing but contempt. The idea that such beings would take in a helpless human infant seems to contradict everything we know about their species. Yet, in a galaxy as vast and as chaotic as the one we inhabit in the 41st millennium, the impossible becomes merely improbable, and the improbable happens with alarming regularity. There are, in fact, several scenarios under which a human child might find themselves among orcs, each one more grim than the last. The most common scenario, and perhaps the most tragic, is the aftermath of a successful orc invasion. When the greenskins descend upon an imperial world, they do so with overwhelming force and unbridled enthusiasm. Cities burn, armies are swept aside, and entire populations are either slaughtered or enslaved. In the chaos and confusion of such an invasion, it is entirely possible for young children to become separated from their families, lost in the ruins of their former homes. Now, you might wonder why orcs would not simply kill such a child on sight. The answer lies in the peculiar nature of orc psychology. While orcs are indeed violent and brutal, they are not mindlessly so. They have a certain pragmatic streak, particularly when it comes to potentially useful slaves. A human child, while weak and useless in the short term, represents future labor, a potential worker for their crude factories and workshops. But there is another factor at play here, one that is rarely discussed in imperial records, because it is simply too bizarre to contemplate. Some orcs, particularly the larger and older ones, have been known to develop what can only be described as a perverse curiosity about other species. They find humans interesting in the way a human might find an exotic pet interesting. A human child, small and relatively harmless, might be kept alive simply because a particularly powerful orc boss found it amusing. Consider also the role of the Gretchen, the smaller cousins of the orcs who perform most of the menial labor in orc society. A human child, while certainly not as naturally servile as a Gretchen, is still small enough and weak enough to fit into similar social niches. They can be put to work fetching things, cleaning, performing simple tasks that orcs consider beneath them. In this capacity, a human child might survive simply by making themselves useful, by becoming part of the background noise of orc society. Then there are the more unusual circumstances. The planet Angelis, featured in the specialist game Gorka Morka, provides us with perhaps the most documented case of humans living alongside orcs. When a massive orc space hulk crashed into this desert world, it was not uninhabited. An Imperial survey team had been working on the planet, and the cataclysmic impact separated them from their ship and scattered them across the hostile landscape. Over generations, isolated from the greater Imperium, subjected to the harsh environment and constant conflict with the orcs who had survived the crash, these humans underwent a profound transformation. They became known as the Diggers, a corrupted form of the old term for their original profession. These humans did not merely survive alongside the orcs. They began to emulate them, to adopt their culture, to speak their language. They painted themselves green, formed themselves into mobs and warbands, wielded crude orc weapons, and engaged in the same brutal tribal conflicts that characterized orc society. They had not forgotten that they were human, exactly, but that knowledge had become secondary to their new identity as warriors in an orcish mold. The case of the Diggers is instructive because it shows us what can happen when humans are exposed to orc culture over extended periods. But it also raises an intriguing possibility. If adult humans, with fully formed identities and memories of imperial civilization, could be so profoundly influenced by prolonged exposure to orcs, what would happen to a child raised from infancy in such an environment? Another avenue through which a human might end up with orcs is through the slave trade. Orcs are known to take slaves from conquered populations, forcing them to work in their crude factories and workshops, manufacturing weapons and ammunition. While most slaves are worked to death or killed in accidents, some manage to survive for extended periods. A child born into slavery among the orcs, or captured at a very young age, would grow up knowing no other life. They would learn to speak orc languages out of necessity, would adapt to orc customs simply to avoid punishment, and over time might become so integrated into orc society that they could not easily return to human civilization. There is also the matter of the Bloodaxes clan, the most unusual of all the major orc clans. The Bloodaxes are known for their willingness to use tactics considered un-orky by other greenskins. They employ camouflage, set ambushes, and even use human weapons and equipment when it suits them. More significantly, they have been known to work with humans on occasion, using them as double agents, infiltrators, and informants. A Bloodaxes warband might see value in raising a human child specifically to serve as a bridge between orc and human cultures, someone who could move in both worlds and provide intelligence on imperial activities. It is worth noting that not all orc warbands are created equal. Feral orcs, those primitive greenskins who are left behind on worlds after the main invasion force has moved on, represent a somewhat different scenario. These orcs have reverted to a more primitive state, using crude stone and bone weapons, relying on hunting and gathering rather than the typical orc appreciation for loud, shooty technology. A human child raised among feral orcs might actually have a slightly easier time of it, as the cultural gap between primitive human societies and feral orc societies is somewhat narrower than the gap between civilized humanity and more typical orc culture. But regardless of how it happens, the fundamental truth remains the same. A human child among orcs is an anomaly, a fragile thing of soft flesh in a world of iron and fungus. Their very presence challenges the normal order of things. They are too small, too weak, too fundamentally different to truly belong. Yet they are also, paradoxically, capable of adapting in ways that even the orcs might not fully understand. Humanity's greatest strength has always been our flexibility, our ability to survive and even thrive in the most hostile environments imaginable. The question is not whether such a scenario is possible. In the vastness of the galaxy, with billions of worlds and countless orc invasions, it has almost certainly happened many times. The question is what such an upbringing does to a person, how it shapes them, how it changes them from the human they might have been into something new, something strange, something that exists in the liminal space between human and orc, belonging fully to neither culture. The first moments of a human child among orcs are crucial, and they set the tone for everything that follows. Imagine the scene, a small child, perhaps having just witnessed the death of their parents, the destruction of their home, standing alone in a landscape of carnage and ruin. The air is thick with smoke and the coppery smell of blood. In the distance, the sounds of battle are fading, replaced by the rough laughter and guttural shouting of victorious orcs looting what remains. Then they appear, not as saviors, but as something far more terrifying. Orcs are massive creatures, standing 7 to 8 feet tall on average, with some of the larger specimens reaching 10 feet or more. Their skin is a deep, vibrant green that seems almost to glow in the dim light. They are heavily muscled, with broad shoulders, thick necks, and arms that seem almost too long for their bodies. Their faces are brutal caricatures of humanity, with heavy brows, small red eyes that gleam with predatory intelligence, and massive jaws filled with yellowed tusks and fangs. For a human child, the first sight of an orc must be absolutely terrifying. These are not the sanitized enemies depicted in propaganda pics. They smell of sweat and engine oil and something musty and fungal. Their weapons are crude but effective, massive cleavers and axes that they wield with casual ease. They move with a rolling, predatory gait, constantly scanning for threats or opportunities for violence. The child's first instinct would be to run, to hide, to seek shelter from these monsters. But there is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The orcs are everywhere, picking through the ruins, arguing over loot, occasionally breaking into brief but intense fights with each other. And then one of them notices the child. What happens next depends entirely on the temperament of that particular orc and the mood they are in. An orc that has just had a good fight might be in high spirits, more inclined to find the situation amusing rather than annoying. An orc that is frustrated or angry might simply lash out, ending the child's life before they even realize what is happening. But let us assume that luck, or perhaps the intervention of the orc gods Gork and Mork, is on the child's side. The orc approaches, its massive form casting a shadow over the small human. It might reach down with a hand the size of the child's torso, rough fingers closing around their arm or the scruff of their clothing. The child is lifted into the air as easily as a human might lift a doll, brought close to the orc's face for inspection. This is a moment of pure terror, held in the grip of a creature that could crush them without effort, staring into eyes that show no empathy, no understanding of human suffering. But something interesting happens here. Orcs, despite their brutality, have a kind of rough hierarchy based on size. They respect bigness, power, the capacity for violence, but they also have a peculiar attitude towards smaller creatures. Gretchen, the diminutive cousins of the orcs, are treated with casual contempt, but are not typically killed out of hand. They are useful, after all, for doing all the boring work that orcs cannot be bothered with. A human child, while clearly not a Gretchen, occupies a similar ecological niche in the orc's mind. Small, weak, but potentially useful. The orc might grunt something in its harsh, guttural language. The child, of course, cannot understand. But the tone is clear enough. This is not a question. It is a statement of ownership. The child has been claimed, either as a curiosity, a slave, or perhaps just as an amusing pet. They are stuffed into a bag or a crude cage, taken back to whatever passes for the orcs' camp or settlement. The journey to the orc camp is itself traumatic. The child is jostled and bounced around, unable to see where they are being taken, hearing only the constant roar of orc voices, arguing, joking, threatening each other. When they finally arrive, they are dumped unceremoniously onto the ground, giving them their first real look at orc society in action. What they see is organized chaos. Orcs are everywhere, engaged in a bewildering variety of activities. Some are working on vehicles, welding bits of scrap metal together with welding torches that belch flame and smoke. Others are fighting, either for sport or to settle disputes, their massive fists and feet doing terrible damage. Still others are eating, tearing into chunks of cooked meat that might be anything from fungus to squig to something the child would rather not think about. And everywhere, there is noise. Orcs are not quiet creatures. They shout constantly, whether in anger or in joy. Their voices a constant roar of sound that assaults the ears. They bang on things, shoot their guns into the air just for the pleasure of hearing them go off, rev their engines for no reason other than that they enjoy the sound. For a human child used to the relative order of imperial society, even a hive city with all its crowds and industry, this is overwhelming. The child's first night among the orcs is unlikely to include anything resembling sleep. Orcs do not require much rest, and when they do sleep, it is usually just a quick nap whenever they feel like it. The concept of a regular sleep schedule, of quiet hours, of respecting others' need for rest, is entirely foreign to them. The camp remains active throughout the night, with orcs working, fighting, and making noise at all hours. For the child, this is the beginning of a harsh education. They must learn quickly that the rules that governed their old life no longer apply. Crying brings no comfort, only annoyed grunts, or perhaps a cuff around the head. Asking for food or water is pointless if you cannot make yourself understood. The soft world of human childhood, with its protections and its care, has been replaced by something raw and unforgiving. But here is where human adaptability begins to show itself. Children are remarkable in their ability to learn, to adapt, to survive, even in this hostile environment. Even surrounded by creatures that view them as little more than a curiosity or a nuisance, the child begins to figure things out. They learn through observation and through painful trial and error. They watch how the Gretchen behave, how they scurry around serving the larger orcs, how they avoid drawing attention to themselves when tempers are running hot. They learn that staying out of the way is crucial. Orcs are not particularly careful about where they step or what they might knock over. Being underfoot when an orc is in a hurry is a good way to get trampled. They learn to read orc body language, to recognize the signs that indicate an orc is about to lash out in anger, to understand when it is safe to approach and when it is better to make themselves scarce. They also begin to learn the basics of orc communication. At first, it is just recognizing their own name, or rather whatever crude approximation of it the orcs have settled on. Then it is understanding simple commands. Come, go, fetch, work. The orc language, while crude, is not entirely incomprehensible to humans. It is, in fact, largely based on a debased and primitive form of Low Gothic, mixed with orcish words and phrases. For a young child, whose brain is still in that critical period for language acquisition, picking up this strange pidgin is easier than it would be for an adult. The physical challenges are immense. Orc food is barely edible by human standards. Much of it is fungus-based, with a taste and texture that is at best unpleasant and at worst nauseating. The water is often dirty, contaminated with oil and other pollutants. The child will almost certainly become sick repeatedly in those first weeks and months, their body struggling to adapt to a diet and environment it was never designed for. And yet, remarkably, many humans do adapt. The human digestive system is surprisingly resilient, capable of extracting nutrition from a wide variety of sources. The human immune system, once it survives the initial onslaught of new pathogens, becomes stronger. Children raised in difficult conditions often develop a toughness that their more sheltered peers lack. But the psychological toll cannot be understated. This is not just a matter of learning to survive in a harsh environment. It is about having your entire understanding of the world fundamentally restructured. Everything the child knew about how society works, about how people should treat each other, about right and wrong, is being replaced by orc values. Might makes right. Violence is not just acceptable but praiseworthy. Weakness deserves no mercy. For a young child whose sense of morality and identity is still forming, this is incredibly impactful. They are not learning to perform orcishness as a survival strategy, something they can put on and take off as needed. They are being fundamentally shaped by this culture in ways that will affect them for the rest of their life. The violence they witness becomes normalized. The brutality becomes part of their understanding of how the world works. This is not Stockholm Syndrome, at least not in the traditional sense. This is something deeper, something more fundamental. It is acculturation in its most extreme form. The child is not just learning to survive among orcs. They are learning to be orky, at least to the extent that their human biology allows. And this is only the beginning. The first weeks and months are about survival, about learning the absolute basics. But as time goes on, as the child becomes more integrated into orc society, the transformation becomes more profound. They begin to internalize orc values, to think like an orc thinks, to see the world through orcish eyes. The human child begins their journey toward becoming something neither fully human nor fully orc, something unique and deeply unsettling to any Imperial citizen who might encounter them. Living among orcs presents physical challenges that would break most adults, let alone a child. The sheer difference in size and strength between humans and orcs creates a constant existential threat. An orc that is merely walking by, not paying attention, can easily knock over or even trample a small human. An orc that is having a playful wrestling match with another orc can crush a human child caught in the middle without even noticing. Every moment among the greenskins is a lesson in vigilance and spatial awareness. The orc environment itself is hostile to human life in ways that extend far beyond the obvious dangers. Their settlements, whether temporary camps or more established strongholds, are not designed with human comfort or safety in mind. There are no railings on high platforms, no warnings about dangerous machinery, no effort made to keep toxic substances away from living areas. Sharp edges abound, from crude metal constructions to the fangs and horns that decorate every surface. The air is often thick with smoke from forges and engines, tall, mixed with the spores that orcs constantly shed from their fungal physiology. These spores present their own unique challenge. Orcs reproduce through spores that are released from their bodies throughout their lives, and especially upon death. These microscopic particles settle into the soil and eventually grow into new orcoid life forms, from the smallest snotlings to full-sized orc boys. For a human breathing this spore-laden air constantly, the health effects are unknown, but certainly cannot be beneficial. The child's immune system must work overtime to prevent fungal infections, respiratory problems, and who knows what other ailments that might arise from prolonged exposure to these alien biological agents. The noise level in orc settlements is another constant assault on human senses. Orcs are loud by nature and by culture. They bellow when they speak, even in what they consider normal conversation. Their machinery is deliberately designed to be as noisy as possible because orcs believe that loud equals powerful. Shooters crack and boom at all hours. Engines roar and sputter. Metal hammers on metal in the workshops of the mech boys. Orcs fight and argue and celebrate, always at maximum volume. For human ears, this is not just annoying, but potentially damaging. The child will almost certainly suffer some degree of hearing loss from prolonged exposure to these noise levels. Sleep, as mentioned before, is nearly impossible under normal human standards. But the human body is remarkably adaptable when it has no choice. The child learns to sleep in short bursts whenever and wherever possible, catching a few hours here and there when the immediate area happens to be relatively quiet. They learn to sleep through levels of noise that would have once been unbearable. Their circadian rhythms, those internal clocks that regulate sleep and wakefulness, begin to adjust to the anarchic schedule of orc society. The physical work demanded of the child is grueling. While they cannot perform the heavy labor that orcs themselves do, they can still be useful in various capacities. They might be set to work in the fungus groves, those areas where the orcoid fungi are cultivated for food and other purposes. This involves pulling weeds, fighting off pests, and harvesting the mature fungi. The work is tedious and dirty, but it is relatively safe compared to other tasks they might be assigned. Alternatively, they might be put to work in the workshops of the mech boys, the orc technicians and engineers. Here, small hands can be useful for reaching into tight spaces, for handling delicate components, for performing tasks that even Gretchen find challenging. The danger here comes from the equipment itself. Orc technology is notoriously unstable, prone to explosions, electrical shocks, and mechanical failures. Working around such equipment without proper training or safety equipment is hazardous in the extreme. Perhaps most disturbingly, the child might be used as a food taster. Orcs are not particularly concerned about food safety, and their own robust constitutions allow them to eat things that would poison most other species. But even orcs can sometimes be poisoned or made sick. And a clever orc boss might use a human child to test suspicious food before eating it themselves. This is a role that comes with obvious risks. The physical abuse is perhaps the most difficult aspect to discuss, but it cannot be ignored. Orc society is built on violence, and this violence extends to everyone in the social hierarchy below you. Orcs cuff their Gretchen for minor infractions, real or imagined. They kick, they punch, they use physical pain as the primary means of establishing dominance and enforcing obedience. A human child in their care would be subject to the same treatment. This is not sadism, at least not in the human sense. Orcs do not generally torture for pleasure. The violence is casual, almost thoughtless, more like a human swatting a misbehaving pet than deliberate cruelty. But the impact on a small human body is severe nonetheless. Bruises, cuts, broken bones, these become part of life. The child learns to take blows without crying out, because showing pain only invites more abuse. They learn to protect their most vulnerable areas, to roll with hits rather than trying to resist them. But the human body, especially a young one, has remarkable capacity for recovery. Broken bones heal, bruises fade, and the constant physical stress actually stimulates growth and strengthening. The child's muscles develop earlier and more robustly than they would in normal human society. Their bones become denser, their skin tougher. They develop the kind of physical resilience that comes only from constant hardship. The diet among orcs is perhaps the most alien aspect of daily life. Orcs are omnivorous in the most extreme sense, capable of digesting almost anything organic and some things that are not. Their primary food source is squigs, symbiotic creatures that are part of the orcoid ecosystem. These come in many varieties, from the small edible squigs that resemble mobile balls of teeth and appetite, to larger varieties used for various purposes. Eating squigs is an adventure in itself. The creatures are often still alive when eaten, requiring quick reflexes to avoid being bitten. The taste is described by the few humans who have tried it as somewhere between spoiled meat and rotten vegetables, with a texture that is simultaneously rubbery and slimy. For a human child, forcing down this food is an act of pure survival instinct, overcoming every natural revulsion. There is also the fungus beer that orcs brew from the same fungi that form the basis of their entire ecosystem. This alcoholic beverage is extraordinarily potent, capable of getting even an orc drunk with relatively small quantities. For a human child exposed to this drink, either deliberately or by accident, the effects would be catastrophic. Alcohol poisoning would be a very real risk, and chronic exposure could lead to developmental problems and addiction. Yet despite all these physical challenges, despite the constant danger and deprivation, the human child survives. More than that, they grow. Their body adapts to the hostile environment in ways that seem almost impossible. They develop immunities to pathogens that would kill an ordinary human. They learn to move through the chaotic orc settlements with a sureness that belies their small size. They become, in essence, physically tougher than almost any human raised in normal conditions could ever be. This physical transformation has psychological dimensions as well. Pain becomes normalized, just another sensation to be endured and ignored. The child's pain tolerance increases dramatically out of pure necessity. They learn to assess injuries objectively, to know when they can keep working through the pain and when they need to seek help, even though help from orcs is crude at best. Interestingly, the child may also develop certain advantages that pure orcs lack. Their smaller size allows them to move through spaces that would be impossible for their larger companions. Their lighter weight means they can climb structures that would collapse under an orc's mass. Their more agile fingers give them advantages in certain types of work. These advantages do not make them equal to orcs, not even close, but they do give the child a niche, a role that they can fill, which justifies their continued existence. The most remarkable aspect of this physical adaptation is that it happens largely unconsciously. The child does not make a deliberate decision to become tougher, to develop these capabilities. It simply happens, driven by the fundamental human survival instinct and the remarkable plasticity of the developing human body. They are being forged, quite literally, in the harshest crucible imaginable, and what emerges is something quite different from the child who entered. But physical adaptation is only part of the story. The body may be capable of adjusting to Ork conditions, but what of the mind? What happens to a child's developing psyche when exposed to constant violence, when taught that the only currency that matters is strength, when shown day after day that compassion is weakness and mercy is for the weak? These questions lead us to the next phase of our examination, the linguistic and cultural transformation that turns a human child into something that can think, speak, and even feel like an Ork. Language is perhaps the most fundamental tool of human civilization. It is how we transmit knowledge, how we build relationships, how we construct our very understanding of reality. For a human child raised among Orks, learning the Ork language is not just a practical necessity for survival. It is a key that unlocks an entirely different way of seeing and understanding the world. The Ork language, or more accurately languages, as there are many dialects that vary between clans and worlds, is a fascinating linguistic puzzle. At its core, it appears to be based on a corrupted form of Imperial Low Gothic, that simplified version of High Gothic used for interstellar communication across the Imperium. But it has been so heavily modified, simplified, and mixed with purely Orkish words that it becomes something entirely new. The grammar of Ork speech is crude and often non-existent. Orks chain words together based more on emotional impact and immediate meaning than on any formal structure. They favor strong, violent imagery and concrete nouns over abstract concepts. A simple concept might be expressed through a series of related words that paint a picture rather than a grammatically correct sentence. For example, an Ork might say, "Big chopper, red, fast, kill Humie good," rather than, "My large axe is red and cuts humans effectively." Pronunciation in Ork language is equally rough and ready. Orks have different mouth and throat structures than humans, allowing them to produce certain sounds that humans find difficult or impossible. Their speech is guttural, full of hard consonants and sharp gutturals. They drop many softer sounds, converting them into harder equivalents. The letter S often becomes Z, Th becomes D, V becomes F. The word that becomes dat, with becomes weef. Boss is often spelled and pronounced boz. For a human child learning this language, it is simultaneously easier and harder than it might be for an adult. Easier because children have a natural facility for language acquisition that adults lack. A young child's brain is primed to soak up linguistic patterns, to learn multiple languages simultaneously if necessary. They can learn to produce the harsh sounds of Ork speech without the self-consciousness that might hamper an adult learner. But it is harder because they are not learning Ork language as a second language, with their native human tongue as a foundation. They are learning it as their primary language, possibly their only language if they were very young when captured. Their understanding of reality itself is being shaped by Orkish linguistic categories and concepts. Consider the implications of this. Language shapes thought in profound ways. The concepts that your language allows you to express easily become the concepts you think about most often. Conversely, ideas that are difficult to express in your language tend to fade from your consciousness. Ork language excels at expressing concepts related to violence, size, power, and immediate physical reality. It struggles with or outright lacks words for abstract concepts like justice, mercy, compassion, long-term planning, or emotional subtlety. A human child learning Ork language as their primary tongue is being taught to think like an Ork thinks. They learn to see the world in terms of dominance hierarchies, to evaluate everything and everyone based on their capacity for violence, to focus on the immediate and concrete, rather than the abstract and distant. The very neural pathways in their brain are being shaped by this linguistic framework. But the child is not just learning to speak Orc. They are also learning to read Orc body language, which is equally important for survival. Orcs communicate as much through posture, gesture, and physical presence as they do through words. The angle of an Orc's shoulders can indicate whether they are relaxed or about to explode into violence. The way an Orc grips their weapon shows their level of aggression. The child learns to read these signals with the same fluency that they learn to understand spoken words. They also learn the complicated system of Orc names and titles. Orc naming conventions are colorful and descriptive, often relating to the individual's characteristics, achievements, or clan affiliation. Names like Gazgukul Mag Uruk Thraka or Bos Zagstruk are not just random sounds but contain meaning that would be obvious to any Orc. The child learns to parse these names, to understand the status and reputation they convey. Moreover, the child learns the subtle differences between various Orc dialects. Different clans have their own variations on the common Orc tongue. The Goths speak in a more clipped, harsh manner. The Blood Axes incorporate more imperial Gothic words into their speech from their dealings with humans. The Evil Sons have terms related to speed that other clans might not use. Understanding these dialectical differences becomes important for navigating the complex social landscape of Orc society. There is also the matter of mech jargon, the specialized technical language used by mech boys when discussing their work. This is actually a more sophisticated form of Orc language, with specific technical terms and a more complex grammar. A child working in the workshops might pick up elements of this jargon, giving them a linguistic repertoire that spans from the crudest street Orc to the relatively refined technical speak of the mechs. Interestingly, the child may also develop a kind of linguistic flexibility that pure Orcs lack. They have a human brain, after all, with all the neural plasticity that implies. While their primary language becomes Orc, they might retain some dim memory of human languages, or more likely, they might develop a capacity to quickly learn or relearn human speech if they are ever exposed to it again. This linguistic adaptability could become crucial later in life. The child also learns the various exclamations, curses, and battle cries that pepper Orc speech. These are not mere words, but almost ritualistic utterances that carry weight and meaning beyond their literal definition. Learning when and how to use these expressions is part of being accepted in Orc society. A human who can bellow fair Gork and Mork with proper enthusiasm is demonstrating their cultural integration in a way that goes beyond mere language. There is one particular linguistic challenge that deserves special attention. The Orc battle cry, that primal howl of aggression that Orcs use when charging into combat. This is not just a sound, it is an expression of the Gestalt psychic field that connects all Orcs, a way of channeling their collective enthusiasm for violence into a single unified roar. For a human to attempt this cry is to participate in something fundamentally alien, to tap into a psychic phenomenon that humans were never meant to access. Yet the child, growing up surrounded by this constant exposure to Orc psychic energy, may develop some limited ability to sense or even partially participate in this field. They will never be fully connected to it as an Orc would be, but they might catch echoes of it, might feel the surge of adrenaline and aggression that ripples through an Orc mob preparing for battle. When they join in the battle cry, they are not just making noise. They are aligning themselves with something primal and powerful. As the years pass and the child grows, their command of Orc language becomes increasingly sophisticated. They learn not just to understand and speak, but to think in Orcish patterns. They dream in Orc language. When they talk to themselves, they do so in the harsh, guttural tones they have learned from their surrogate family. The language of their birth, assuming they ever had a chance to learn it, fades to a dim echo or disappears entirely. This linguistic transformation is perhaps one of the most profound aspects of being raised by orcs. It represents a fundamental rewiring of how the brain processes and understands the world. When you think in a language that celebrates violence and crude directness, when your vocabulary is rich in words for weapons and fighting, but poor in words for emotional nuance, you become a different person than you would have been. Language does not just describe reality, it creates it, and for a child raised speaking Orc, the reality they inhabit is one shaped by Orcish values and perceptions. But language is only one component of culture. To truly understand Orc society, we must examine their social structures, their hierarchies, their customs and traditions. How does a human child navigate a social world built on principles so utterly foreign to human nature? That is the question we must explore next, as we delve into the strange and brutal world of Orc social organization. Orc society, at first glance, appears to be pure anarchy. Orcs fight constantly. Shifting alliances form and dissolve seemingly at random, and the only law appears to be the law of the strongest. But look more closely, and patterns emerge. Orc society is actually highly structured, with clear hierarchies, defined roles, and even something resembling social institutions. Understanding these structures is crucial for any human trying to survive, and perhaps even thrive, among the greenskins. The fundamental organizing principle of Orc society is simple and brutal. Bigger equals better. Size is not just an indicator of physical strength in Orc culture. It is a direct measure of status, power, and authority. The biggest Orcs are in charge, period. There are no elections, no hereditary titles, no complex bureaucracies. If you are bigger than another Orc, you can boss them around. If they think they are tougher than you, they can challenge you to a fight, and the winner of that fight establishes the new pecking order. This creates a very stable, if violent, social structure. At the bottom are the Gretchen and Snotlings, the smallest members of the Orcoid species. They do all the menial work, the boring tasks that the Orcs cannot be bothered with. They are kicked, bullied, and generally treated as expendable. But they are also necessary for the functioning of Orc society, so they are kept alive and relatively healthy. Above the Gretchen are the regular Orc boys, the common warriors that make up the bulk of any Orc force. These Orcs are roughly the same size as each other, generally somewhere between 7 and 8 feet tall, powerfully built and eager for a fight. They form mobs, groups of Orcs who fight together and share loot. Within each mob, there is constant jockeying for position, small fights and contests of strength that establish who is the toughest among equals. Rising above the regular boys are the Nobs, Orcs who have proven themselves in battle and grown larger and stronger as a result. Nobs are typically 9 to 10 feet tall, covered in scars and trophies from their many victories, equipped with the best weapons and armor that the mob can provide. They command respect through sheer physical intimidation and demonstrated prowess in combat. At the very top of the hierarchy are the war bosses, the biggest and meanest Orcs around. A war boss can stand 12 feet tall or more, a towering mountain of muscle and fungal flesh, decorated with kill markings and battle scars, wielding weapons that would require a small crew to operate in human hands. The war boss rules through a combination of raw strength, cunning, and sheer force of personality. They keep their followers in line, not through complex management strategies, but through the simple expedient of being able to beat up anyone who challenges them. For a human child in this society, the question becomes, where do they fit? They are obviously not a Gretchen, though they might initially be treated like one. They are too small and too weak to ever be a proper Orc boy, let alone a Nob or boss. They exist in a strange liminal space, neither fully part of the hierarchy nor completely outside of it. Their survival strategy must be based on carving out a niche that allows them to exist without constantly being crushed by the weight of Orc social structures. This often means making themselves useful in ways that do not threaten the established order. A human who can fix things, who has clever hands for delicate work, who can remember things that orcs forget. These traits have value without challenging any orc's position in the dominance hierarchy. The child also learns to navigate the complex world of orc clans. While the size-based hierarchy is universal among orcs, there is another layer of organization that cuts across it. Orcs belong to clans, cultural and possibly genetic groupings that share certain characteristics and philosophies. There are 6 major clans found throughout the galaxy, each with their own distinct approach to being Orky. The Goths are the largest and most numerous clan, known for their love of close combat and their aggressive, no-nonsense attitude. They wear black and check patterns, favor huge close combat weapons, and consider themselves the toughest orcs around. A human among Goths would need to demonstrate physical toughness and a willingness to fight, even though they can never match an orc in direct combat. The evil sons are obsessed with speed. They paint everything red because they believe, and through their psychic gestalt field make true. That red makes things go faster. They drive fast vehicles, favor quick attacks, and have little patience for anything that slows them down. A human among evil sons might find a role as a vehicle crew member, their smaller size allowing them to fit into tight spaces in the ramshackle war machines. The Bad Moons are the richest orcs, their teeth, which serve as currency in orc society, growing faster than those of other clans. They are flashy, ostentatious, always buying the best gear and showing off their wealth. A human among Bad Moons might become involved in trade, using their human cunning to help broker deals and manage the flow of goods. The Death Skulls are looters and scavengers par excellence. They believe that blue is lucky, and they take anything that is not nailed down, and some things that are. They have a reputation for being slightly more pragmatic than other orcs, willing to use whatever works, regardless of where it came from. A human among Death Skulls might find it easier to be accepted, as this clan is more open to using and incorporating non-orc elements. The Blood Axes are the most unusual clan, the ones who have had the most contact with humans and other species. They use tactics that other orcs consider un-orky, like camouflage, retreat, and planning. They are willing to work with humans when it suits them. A human among Blood Axes is in perhaps the best position of all, as this clan actually sees value in having humans around as translators, guides, and infiltrators. The Snakebites are the most traditional clan, preferring old ways and distrusting technology. They ride into battle on boars and other beasts, use more primitive weapons, and maintain traditions that other clans have forgotten. Interestingly, a human among Snakebites might find some advantages, as this clan's more primitive lifestyle is closer to what a human can physically manage. The child learns to recognize these clan affiliations by colors, symbols, and behaviors. They learn which clans they can safely approach, and which ones are more likely to see them as a target or a nuisance. This cultural literacy becomes crucial for navigating the broader orc society beyond their immediate mob or warband. There are also specialist roles within orc society that the child becomes aware of. The mech boys, the technical specialists who build and maintain orc technology, operate their own workshops and command respect for their skills. The pain boys, the orc equivalent of doctors, perform brutal but sometimes effective surgeries and medical procedures. The weird boys, orc psychers, who channel the violent psychic energy of their race, are both respected and feared for their unpredictable powers. A human child might find opportunities to work with these specialists. Their small hands and human dexterity could be useful to a mech boy. Their ability to remember things and follow complex instructions might make them valuable to a pain boy. They would likely stay far away from weird boys, whose wild psychic eruptions are dangerous to everyone nearby. The child also learns the importance of loot and trophies in orc culture. Orcs do not just fight for the sake of fighting, though that is certainly part of it. They also fight for loot, for the spoils of victory. The best weapons, the flashiest armor. the most impressive trophies, these things confer status. An orc who has personally killed a space marine and taken his armor or weapons is immediately elevated in the eyes of other orcs. For a human in orc society, being able to contribute to the acquisition of good loot is a way to gain acceptance. If they can help maintain or improve looted equipment, if they can spot valuable salvage that an orc might overlook, if they can use their human knowledge to identify particularly valuable targets, these skills have real currency in orc culture. Perhaps most importantly, the child learns the complex system of respect and challenge that governs orc interactions. Orcs respect strength, but they also respect cunning, at least the brutal kind of cunning embodied by their god Mork. An orc who wins through a clever trick is not scorned but admired as long as the trick involves violence at some point. The child learns to read these dynamics, to understand when an orc is genuinely angry and when they are just engaging in the ritual threats and posturing that passes for normal social interaction among greenskins. They also learn about the peculiar orc sense of humor. Orcs find violence funny. They find pain funny, at least when it is happening to someone else. They find destruction funny, they find loud noises funny, and they find pratfalls and slapstick comedy hilarious. A human who can make an orc laugh is a human who has a better chance of survival. The child might become something of an entertainer, performing acts or telling stories that play into this crude sense of humor. All of this social learning happens unconsciously, absorbed through constant exposure and painful experience. The child is not studying orc society like an anthropologist. They are living it, navigating it daily, learning the rules through a combination of observation and the immediate negative feedback that comes from making mistakes. By the time they are a teenager, they understand orc social dynamics with an instinctive fluency that would take a human scholar years of study to acquire, and even then, the scholar would lack the visceral, lived understanding that comes from actually being part of the culture. This deep immersion in orc social structures has profound effects on the child's developing sense of identity and morality. They are learning that the world operates on principles of might making right, that violence is a normal and acceptable way to resolve disputes, that showing weakness invites predation. These lessons are being absorbed at a developmental stage when the human brain is most plastic, most capable of being shaped by experience. The child is not just learning about orc society, they are being fundamentally reshaped by it. But social structures alone do not make a culture. There is also religion, belief, the spiritual dimension of orcish existence. And it is here, in the realm of orc theology and cosmology, that we encounter some of the strangest and most alien aspects of greenskin culture. How does a human child make sense of gods like Gork and Mork? How do they relate to beliefs that seem simultaneously simple and incomprehensibly foreign? These are the questions we turn to next. Religion among the orcs is a curious thing, simultaneously simple and profound. Every orc knows about Gork and Mork, the twin gods of the greenskins. These are not distant, abstract deities requiring faith and interpretation. To an orc, Gork and Mork are as real as the ground beneath their feet, and their nature is perfectly straightforward. Gork is brutal but cunning. Mork is cunning but brutal. The difference, an orc will tell you with absolute certainty, is obvious. Gork will smash you over the head with his club when you are looking at him. Mork will sneak up behind you and give you a good kicking when you are not paying attention. For a human raised among orcs, understanding this religious framework requires a fundamental shift in thinking. Gork and Mork are not gods in the human sense, demanding worship, offering salvation, requiring complex theological interpretations. They are gods in the orcish sense, which means they embody the ideals that orcs most value: violence, cunning, strength, and the pure joy of a good fight. An orc does not pray to Gork and Mork for guidance in the way a human might pray to the emperor. They shout to them before battle, invoke their names when smashing enemies, and build crude effigies in their honor after victories. The child is exposed to this religious practice from their earliest days among the Orks. They see the crude idols that Orks build from dung, stones, and scrap metal, representations of their gods that are more symbolic than literal. They hear the Orks bellowing, "Fair Gork and Mork," before charging into battle. They witness the Weird Boys, those Ork psychers who channel the violent psychic energies of their race, perform what might charitably be called religious rituals, though these ceremonies usually involve a lot of shouting, violence, and spontaneous psychic eruptions. One of the most important religious concepts for the child to understand is the Great Stomp, or Battle Eternal. Orks believe that Gork and Mork spend most of their time fighting each other, wrestling and punching and kicking in an endless battle that will never have a winner. But when they get bored of fighting each other, they turn their attention to the material world, stomping on anyone they deem unworthy or amusing targets. This theological framework explains everything an Ork needs to know about the nature of existence. Life is a fight. Everyone is trying to stomp everyone else, and the gods themselves are just bigger, better fighters. The child learns that pleasing Gork and Mork is not about moral behavior or spiritual purity. It is about fighting well, about being properly Orky. An Ork who runs from battle, who shows cowardice, who fails to be sufficiently violent and aggressive, risks the wrath of the gods. But an Ork who fights with enthusiasm, who displays proper brutality and cunning, earns divine favor in the form of good luck in battle, and perhaps, eventually, a place in the eternal brawl alongside Gork and Mork themselves. This religious framework has no room for concepts like sin, redemption, or spiritual growth in the human sense. There is no Ork equivalent of confession or penance. If you do something wrong by Ork standards, meaning you show weakness or cowardice, the punishment is immediate and physical, not spiritual. The gods are not watching your every action and judging your soul. They are somewhere in the warp having a good scrap, and they might notice you if you are impressive enough, but otherwise, they have better things to do. For a human child, this religious system might actually be easier to understand than the complex theological frameworks of the Imperium. There are no confusing doctrines about the nature of the God-Emperor, no debates about proper interpretation of Scripture, no worried contemplation of heresy and orthodoxy. Gork and Mork want you to fight. That is literally all they care about. If you fight well, you are doing religion right. If you do not, you are doing it wrong. And the correction comes in the form of a boot to the head from a bigger Ork, not eternal damnation or excommunication. The child might even come to believe in Gork and Mork in a way that is genuine, not merely performative. Constant exposure to Ork religious practices, combined with the psychic energy that permeates all Ork culture, could create something resembling actual faith. When every Ork around you believes absolutely and completely in the reality of their gods, when that belief is backed by psychic energy that can be felt if not directly seen, skepticism becomes difficult. Moreover, the child might witness events that appear to be divine intervention from an Orkish perspective. A weird boy successfully channeling psychic energy to blast enemies could be seen as Gork, or Mork lending their strength to the battle. An incredibly unlikely victory against overwhelming odds might be interpreted as the gods favoring their followers. The child, lacking any other explanatory framework, might accept these Orkish interpretations. There is also the matter of the Gestalt psychic field that all Orks generate collectively. This field, sometimes called the battle energy, is real and measurable, at least by those with psychic sensitivity. It grows stronger when more Orks are gathered together, and it reaches its peak during massive conflicts. This field has tangible effects on reality. It makes Ork technology work better than it should. It influences probability in favor of the Orks. It creates a sense of unity and shared purpose among the greenskins. A human child raised among Orks, constantly bathed in this psychic field, might develop some limited sensitivity to it. They would never be able to tap into it the way an Ork does. Their human brain is not wired for it. but they might feel echoes of it, a sense of rising excitement and aggression when the orcs around them are getting ready for battle, a feeling of connection to something larger than themselves when participating in orc rituals and celebrations. This is where the situation becomes truly strange and unsettling from an imperial perspective. The child is not just learning about orc religion as an outside observer. They are participating in it, feeling its effects, potentially even believing in it. They are shouting praise to Gork and Mork alongside their orc companions. They are painting crude representations of the orcish gods on their possessions. They are internalizing a religious worldview that is fundamentally incompatible with human imperial faith. The ecclesiarchy, the religious authority of the Imperium, teaches that the God Emperor is the one true deity, that Xenos religions are blasphemous perversions, that to participate in alien worship is the gravest heresy. By these standards, a human raised among orcs and participating in their religious practices is not just a victim of unfortunate circumstances, but an active heretic deserving of purging. The child, of course, has no awareness of these imperial standards. They are simply doing what everyone around them does, following the cultural norms of the only society they know. It is worth noting that not all orcs are equally religious. Some orcs, particularly those of certain clans like the Blood Axes, treat Gork and Mork more like cultural symbols than active deities requiring regular worship. Other orcs, especially among the more traditional clans like the Snakebites, maintain more elaborate religious practices and traditions. The child's religious experience will vary depending on which type of orc culture they are exposed to. The child might also learn about various orc superstitions and folk beliefs that exist alongside the main religious framework. Orcs believe that certain colors have mystical properties. Red makes things go faster. Blue is lucky. Yellow is more explodey. These beliefs are not quite religious, but they are not purely practical either. They exist in a grey area between faith and practice, and they are reinforced by the psychic gestalt field that makes orc beliefs partially real. A human learning these superstitions might initially dismiss them as nonsense, but repeated exposure to situations where they seem to work could change minds. When you see orc vehicles painted red consistently moving faster than identical unpainted vehicles, when you observe that orcs who paint themselves blue do seem to have better luck surviving battles, skepticism becomes harder to maintain. The child learns to accept these beliefs, not necessarily because they make logical sense, but because they appear to work within the orcish cultural context. There is also the matter of ancestral spirits and honored dead in orc belief. Orcs do not have a complex ancestor worship system like some cultures, but they do remember particularly impressive warriors from the past. These legendary figures become part of the oral tradition, their deeds recounted and embellished with each retelling. A human raised among orcs would learn these stories, would hear about great war bosses of the past, about legendary battles, about times when the orcs conquered entire sectors. These stories serve a similar function to human religious myths and legends. They provide moral examples, they reinforce cultural values, and they create a sense of continuity and shared history. The child learns what it means to be properly orky by hearing about orcs who embodied those values in the past. They learn what kind of behavior is celebrated and what kind is condemned through these oral traditions. By the time the child reaches adolescence, their religious worldview has been thoroughly shaped by orc beliefs. They might retain some dim memory of human religious concepts if they were old enough to have been exposed to them before capture, but these memories would be overlaid and largely replaced by orcish frameworks. The God Emperor, if they even remember such a concept, becomes just another god, probably not as impressive as Gork and Mork, who are clearly the biggest and the best. This religious transformation is perhaps one of the most complete aspects of the child's acculturation. Language can be relearned, social behaviors can be adapted, but religious beliefs formed during childhood often persist for life. A human who has spent their formative years believing in Gork and Mork who has participated in Orkish religious practices, who has felt the psychic resonance of Ork faith, is profoundly changed in ways that might be irreversible. But belief alone does not make a warrior. The Orks are, above all else, a martial culture. Violence is not just tolerated or accepted, it is celebrated, ritualized, and made central to every aspect of existence. For a human child to survive and function in this culture, they must not only understand violence, but embrace it. They must learn to fight, and more than that, they must learn to love fighting in the way that Orks do. This is perhaps the darkest aspect of what it means to be raised by Orks, and it is to this topic that we now turn. From the earliest moments among the Orks, violence is a constant presence in the child's life. Not just the threat of violence, though that is omnipresent, but actual violence witnessed, experienced, and eventually participated in. Orks fight constantly. They fight enemies, certainly, but they also fight each other. Small disputes over food, tools, or simply because one orc looked at another orc, funny escalate into brief but intense physical altercations. These fights are not duels with rules and honor. They are brutal, often one-sided beatings that end when one party is unconscious, severely injured, or wise enough to run away. The child witnesses these fights daily. They see orcs punching each other in the face over trivial matters. They watch as larger orcs dominate smaller ones through sheer physical intimidation. They observe the aftermath: broken teeth, bleeding wounds, crushed limbs, and occasionally death. For a human child, especially one too young to have developed significant emotional defenses, this constant exposure to violence is traumatic. The psychological literature on children exposed to violence suggests several possible outcomes. Some children become withdrawn, attempting to make themselves invisible to avoid becoming targets. Others develop a hypervigilance, constantly scanning for threats and ready to flee at the first sign of danger. Still others begin to normalize the violence, accepting it as simply how the world works. For a child among orcs, with no possibility of escape and no adult protection, this last adaptation is perhaps the most likely. The violence becomes normalized not just cognitively, but emotionally. The child's initial horror and fear fade, replaced by a kind of detached acceptance. This is not a conscious choice, but a psychological survival mechanism. To remain in constant fear and distress would be mentally and physically exhausting to the point of breakdown. The mind adapts by recategorizing violence from a special traumatic event to a normal, everyday occurrence. But exposure is only the first stage. Eventually, inevitably, the child will be expected to participate in violence themselves. This might start small. Perhaps they are told to hit a Gretchen who has annoyed an orc. Perhaps they are given a stick and told to help guard something, with the implicit understanding that this means being willing to use that stick on anyone who approaches. These initial forays into violence are tests, ways for the orcs to see if the human has what it takes to survive in their culture. For most humans, even those raised in violent circumstances, there is a profound psychological barrier to using serious violence against another thinking being. Humans are social animals with strong inhibitions against harming members of our own group. Military training throughout history has focused extensively on breaking down these inhibitions, using various psychological techniques to make soldiers capable of killing when ordered to do so. A human child among orcs undergoes a similar but even more extreme process of desensitization and conditioning. They are taught, explicitly and implicitly, that violence is not just necessary but good. They see that orcs who fight well are respected and admired. They observe that showing mercy or hesitation marks you as weak and invites predation. They learn through painful personal experience that failing to defend yourself results in beatings that no one will intervene to stop. The child's first serious fight is a crucial moment. Perhaps it is with another young human slave, a conflict over scarce resources, or a perceived slight. Perhaps it is with a Gretchen who has pushed them too far. Regardless of the opponent, this first real violence is transformative. There is a profound difference between witnessing violence and enacting it yourself. The rush of adrenaline, the shock of physical impact, the visceral, immediate nature of hand-to-hand combat, these experiences create neural pathways and emotional associations that persist for life. If the child wins their first fight, they experience a flood of positive reinforcement. The orcs who witness it laugh and cheer. They clap the child on the back, perhaps hand them a crude weapon or a bit of food as a reward. They gain a modicum of respect, a slight increase in status. This positive reinforcement following violence is incredibly powerful, especially for a child desperate for any form of approval or acceptance in their hostile environment. If the child loses their first fight, the lesson is different but equally important. They learn that losing hurts, that showing weakness makes them a target, that they need to be better prepared next time. The pain and humiliation of defeat become powerful motivators to train harder, to become tougher, to ensure that the next fight has a different outcome. As the child grows older and physically stronger, they are expected to take on more serious combat roles. They might be given a proper weapon, crude by human standards, but deadly nonetheless. They might be included in raids or battles, initially in support roles but gradually moving toward direct combat. Each fight they survive adds to their experience and their combat effectiveness. The training they receive is brutal and practical. Orcs do not have formal combat schools or systematic training programs. They learn to fight by fighting, starting with small conflicts and working up to larger ones. A young orc learns to use a chopper by practicing on targets and then using it in real combat. The child receives the same education, though adapted for their smaller size and different physiology. They learn that human advantages in a fight with orcs come from speed and cunning rather than strength. They cannot overpower an orc, but they can potentially outmaneuver one. They can use reach weapons to keep larger opponents at a distance. They can target weak points that even orcs have, going for eyes, throats, joints. They learn to fight dirty because in orc culture, there is no such thing as fighting fair. Any tactic that works is a good tactic. The child also learns to use whatever weapons they can get their hands on. Orcs favor large, brutal weapons like choppers and power claws, but these are too heavy and unwieldy for a human of average size. Instead, the child might use smaller blades, improvised weapons, or even looted human firearms if they can be obtained. They become proficient with these weapons through constant practice and actual combat experience. There is also the matter of pain tolerance and physical toughness. Combat inevitably results in injuries. The child learns to fight through pain, to keep going even when hurt. They develop calluses, both physical and psychological. They learn field medicine out of necessity, how to stop bleeding, how to set broken bones, how to treat infections with whatever crude remedies are available. The psychological toll of becoming a warrior in this fashion is severe. Each time the child uses violence, each time they hurt or kill another being, it becomes a little bit easier. The emotional barriers that prevent most humans from using lethal force erode away. They are not becoming psychopaths exactly. They still have emotions, still feel fear and pain and even occasional joy. But their capacity for violence has been fundamentally altered. Where a normal human might hesitate before using potentially lethal force, the orc-raised human acts without thought, their response automatic and brutal. There is a particular moment of horror that many such individuals must eventually confront. The first time they kill another human. Perhaps it is another slave in a fight over resources. Perhaps it is an Imperial soldier during a raid, someone who from an objective standpoint should be their ally. Someone who represents what they might have been in another life. But in the moment, that person is just another enemy to be defeated, another opponent to be overcome with violence. The psychological impact of killing a human while yourself being human, but raised to think like an orc, creates a profound cognitive dissonance. The child might feel guilt, might experience distress, but these emotions are quickly overridden by the cultural programming of their orc upbringing. Weakness is to be stamped out. Guilt is for humies who don't know how to fight proper. The gods favor the strong and mock the weak. By the time the child reaches their teenage years, they have become a genuinely dangerous fighter. They may not be as strong as an orc, but they are faster, more agile, and surprisingly skilled at violence. They have killed, perhaps many times. They bear scars from their battles, physical reminders of their violent education. They have fully internalized the orcish love of combat, the joy of a good fight that drives every greenskin. This transformation is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of being raised by orcs. The child has been turned into a weapon, a warrior capable of extreme violence, someone who sees combat not as a last resort, but as a primary way of interacting with the world. They have lost something essential to humanity, some moral compass that says violence should be avoided when possible, that killing is wrong except in extremis. They have gained in its place an orcish worldview that celebrates violence as the highest form of self-expression. The implications of this transformation are profound. This is not just a human who has been forced to fight for survival. This is a human who has been fundamentally reshaped by their environment, who thinks like an orc, who feels like an orc to the extent that their biology allows, who has become something that exists between species and cultures. They are, in many ways, the living embodiment of the Digonobs, those humans of Angelis who became so integrated with orc culture that they were barely recognizable as human anymore. And speaking of the Digonobs, it is time we examine them in detail. These remarkable humans provide us with the best documented case study of what happens when humans not just survive among orcs, but embrace orc culture completely. Their story illuminates the extreme endpoint of human cultural adaptation, showing us what the child we have been following might eventually become. The Digonobs, or simply Diggers as they are more commonly known, originated on the desert world of Angelis. This harsh planet became the crash site of a massive orc space hulk, one of those vast conglomerations of fused spacecraft that the greenskins use to travel through the void. The crash was catastrophic, tearing a great canyon across the planet's surface and scattering wreckage for hundreds of miles. But Angelis was not uninhabited. An Imperial survey team, believed to be from the Adeptus Mechanicus, had been working on the planet when the Orc hulk arrived. The impact of the crash separated these humans from their ship in orbit and scattered them across the hostile landscape. With no way off-world and no hope of immediate rescue, these humans were forced to survive in an environment now dominated by orcs. The generations that followed witnessed a remarkable and disturbing transformation. Cut off from the Imperium, subjected to the harsh conditions of a desert world, and in constant contact with the orcs who had also survived the crash, these humans began to change. They did not just adapt their tactics or their technology, they adapted their entire culture, their very identity. The modern Diggers of Angelis have forgotten much of their imperial heritage. They know they are descended from humans, but this knowledge has become almost mythological to them, a dim memory of ancient times. What matters to them now is survival in their current environment, and they have learned that the best way to survive near orcs is to become as much like orcs as possible. The Diggers organize themselves into mobs, mimicking the orc social structure. They have leaders called Digonobs, large and powerful individuals who command their followers through a combination of charisma and physical prowess. They paint themselves green, applying crude pigments to their skin in an attempt to look more orky. They adopt orc-style names and titles, shedding their original imperial identities in favor of names like Grot Cutter or Snakebite. Perhaps most tellingly, the Diggers have fully embraced orc religious beliefs. They worship Gork and Mork with the same fervor as any greenskin, building crude idols and invoking the twin gods before battle. They have internalized the orcish worldview to such an extent that they genuinely believe themselves to be following the best and most sensible way of life. They see the orcs not as enemies or oppressors, but as examples to be emulated. The relationship between Diggers and orcs on Angelis is complex and fascinating. The orcs generally tolerate the Diggers with a kind of amused contempt. They find it funny that these humies are trying to be orky, like a child playing dress-up. The Orks call the diggers' home territory by an Orkish name that translates roughly to Fortress of Ancient, Terrifying Power, Land of Waiting Death, Pain and Destruction, which shows both their awareness that the diggers are based in dangerous ruins and a certain respect for the threat those ruins represent. The diggers trade with the Orks, exchanging scrap metal and artifacts dug from the ruins for Ork weapons and technology. This trade relationship benefits both groups and provides a reason for the Orks to keep the diggers alive, rather than simply wiping them out. Some diggers even fight alongside Orks on occasion, participating in raids and battles, though they are never fully trusted and are typically given the most dangerous or unpleasant tasks. The equipment used by diggers is a mix of scavenged Imperial technology, crude Ork weapons obtained through trade, and their own improvised creations. They use shooters and choppers just like Orks do, though these weapons are often too large and heavy for human frames, requiring adaptation and modification. They drive ramshackle vehicles, cobbled together from spare parts, painted in garish colors according to Ork superstitions about what colors do what. From an outside perspective, the diggers represent a cautionary tale about what happens when humans are isolated from Imperial culture and exposed to Xenos influence. They have not merely been corrupted, they have been fundamentally transformed, their entire cultural identity rewritten along Orkish lines. The ecclesiarchy would view them as heretics of the highest order, their worship of Gork and Mork being unforgivable apostasy. The Inquisition would likely order their immediate extermination, seeing them as too far gone to be saved. But from the perspective of our hypothetical child raised by Orks, the diggers represent a possible future. They show what a human fully integrated into Ork culture might look like as an adult. They demonstrate that it is possible not just to survive among Orks, but to find a kind of belonging there, to create a functional, if bizarre, hybrid culture that draws from both human and Ork elements. There are, of course, limits to how Orky a human can become. Diggers cannot grow to Ork size no matter how many fights they win. They do not have the fungal biology that gives Orks their incredible resilience and regenerative capabilities. They cannot tap into the psychic gestalt field in the way true Orks can. Their weapons do not work quite as well because they lack that Orkish belief, backed by psychic power, that makes Ork technology function. The diggers have evolved various strategies to compensate for these biological limitations. They rely more on ranged weapons than Orks typically do, recognizing that engaging in close combat with greenskins is suicidal for most humans. They use speed and mobility to their advantage, employing hit-and-run tactics rather than the straightforward charges that Orks favor. They take advantage of their human intelligence and capacity for planning, qualities that Orks possess but often neglect, in favor of more direct approaches. Interestingly, the diggers have also developed a mystical dimension to their culture that goes beyond simple Ork worship. They have shamans, human psychers, who have learned to channel their powers in ways influenced by Ork weirdboys. These individuals are dangerous and valuable, capable of providing supernatural support in battle while risking catastrophic psychic backlash with each use of their powers. The diggers also maintain certain human traits that Orks lack. They are better at complex planning and organization. They can maintain more sophisticated social structures. They form emotional bonds that go deeper than the simple dominance hierarchies of Ork society. A digger mob might include family groups, friendships, loyalties based on shared history rather than just immediate utility. These human elements, combined with Orkish cultural practices, create something genuinely unique. For all their apparent regression to barbarism, the diggers have achieved something remarkable. They have survived for generations on a death world, surrounded by Orks, without the support and resources of the Imperium. They have created a sustainable culture adapted to their extreme environment. From a certain perspective, this is humanity's greatest strength in action, the ability to adapt to any circumstance, to survive anywhere, to make a life even in the most hostile conditions imaginable. But at what cost? The diggers have lost their connection to humanity's greater civilization. They have abandoned the imperial creed, the belief in the god emperor that unifies human space. They have adopted Xenos ways, forsaken their birthright as humans, and become something that the Imperium would not recognize or accept as human. They have survived, yes, but they have done so by ceasing to be imperial citizens in any meaningful sense. Our hypothetical child raised by orcs might well end up becoming something very like a digger, assuming they survive to adulthood. They would be a human who looks like a human, but thinks like an orc, believes like an orc, and fights like an orc. They would paint themselves green, worship Gork and Mork, and feel more kinship with orcs than with other humans. They would be, in every sense that matters, neither human nor orc, but something in between, a cultural hybrid that defies easy categorization. The existence of the diggers proves that this transformation is not just theoretically possible, but has actually happened. Somewhere in the galaxy, there are humans who call themselves by orc names, who lead orc-style lives, who have become so thoroughly integrated into greenskin culture that they are barely recognizable as human. The child we have been following through this thought experiment could easily become one of them, given time and circumstance. But what of the psychological dimension of this transformation? We have discussed the external changes, the learned behaviors, the adopted beliefs. But what happens inside the mind of such a person? How does their sense of self develop? What does it feel like to be human in biology, but orcish in culture? These questions are crucial for understanding the full horror and fascination of being raised by orcs. The psychological transformation of a human raised by orcs is perhaps the most profound and disturbing aspect of this entire scenario. It is one thing to learn orc language, to adopt orc customs, even to participate in orc violence. These are behavioral adaptations, survival strategies that could theoretically be unlearned. But the deeper psychological changes, the restructuring of identity and worldview that occurs during formative years, these are far more permanent. Identity formation is a crucial developmental task during childhood and adolescence. It is the process by which we come to understand who we are, what we value, and where we fit in the world. For most humans, this process occurs within a human cultural context, surrounded by human role models, taught human values. Our identity forms in relation to our culture, our family, our community of peers. For a child raised by orcs, this process is fundamentally disrupted. They have no human role models, no human cultural context, no human peer group. Instead, their identity forms in relation to orc culture. The values they internalize are orcish values. The behaviors they learn to emulate are orcish behaviors. The community they seek to belong to is an orc warband. This creates a kind of identity confusion that is difficult for those raised in normal circumstances to comprehend. The child knows, on some level, that they are different from the orcs around them. They can see that their skin is not green, that they are smaller and weaker, that their body works differently. But this objective knowledge conflicts with their subjective experience of themselves as part of orc society. Psychologists who study identity development in cross-cultural adoptions have found that adopted children often struggle with questions of identity and belonging, even when adopted into loving families of a different ethnicity or culture. Now imagine that same identity confusion, but magnified 1,000-fold. Not just adopted into another culture, but into a different species culture. Not raised by loving parents trying to bridge cultural gaps, but by beings who see you as somewhere between a pet and a slave. The child's self-concept becomes deeply conflicted. In their mind, they are orky. They speak orc language. They follow orc customs. They worship orc gods. They fight like an orc. But the world around them constantly reminds them that they are not truly orc. They are too small, too weak, too different. Other orcs might tolerate them, might even develop a kind of fondness for them, but they will never truly see them as one of their own. This liminal identity, neither fully human nor orc, creates its own unique psychological challenges. The child belongs nowhere completely. They cannot fit seamlessly into orc society due to their biological differences, but they also could never fit into human society due to their cultural conditioning. They are permanently other, permanently on the outside, permanently trying to bridge a gap that cannot truly be crossed. This psychological state might manifest in various ways. Some individuals might become hyper-aggressive, constantly trying to prove themselves to be as tough as any orc, overcompensating for their physical limitations through displays of extreme violence and bravado. Others might lean into cunning and intelligence, recognizing that these human traits give them advantages that pure orcs lack, and building an identity around being the clever one in a society of brutes. The child also faces the psychological impact of constant traumatic stress. The violence they witness and experience, the lack of stable attachments, the constant threat to their survival. All of these factors would be recognized by modern psychology as severely traumatic. In a normal context, such trauma would likely lead to conditions like PTSD, anxiety disorders, or developmental trauma, but in the orc context, these traumatic experiences are normalized. The child has no safe space to process their trauma, no supportive adults to help them understand and cope with what they are experiencing. Instead, they must develop their own coping mechanisms, their own ways of making sense of the chaos around them. These mechanisms might be effective for survival in orc society, but deeply maladaptive in any other context. One common coping mechanism in traumatic environments is emotional numbing. The child learns to shut down their emotional responses to violence and suffering, to not feel too deeply because feelings are dangerous. This numbing allows them to function in their hostile environment, but robs them of much of what makes human experience rich and meaningful. Joy, love, empathy, compassion, all of these positive emotions become muted along with the negative ones. Another coping mechanism is identification with the aggressor. Rather than seeing themselves as a victim, the child comes to identify with the orcs, to see themselves as one of the perpetrators rather than one of the victims. This psychological defense helps maintain self-esteem in a situation where being viewed as weak or victim-like would be dangerous. But it also means internalizing the values and perspectives of those who are, in objective terms, their captors and abusers. The child might also develop what psychologists call a survival mode mentality, where all thought and action is focused on immediate survival rather than long-term goals or abstract concerns. This makes sense in an environment where death is always one mistake away. But it also prevents the kind of reflective thinking, long-term planning, and abstract reasoning that are hallmarks of human cognition. The child becomes reactive rather than proactive, responding to immediate threats rather than considering larger patterns or possibilities. Attachment theory suggests that children need stable, caring relationships with adult caregivers to develop healthy emotional regulation and social skills. The child among orcs has nothing resembling this. Orcs do not form the kind of emotional bonds that humans do. Even if an orc takes a liking to the child, this affection is casual and unstable, likely to disappear the moment the child becomes inconvenient or annoying. This lack of secure attachment has profound developmental consequences. The child never learns to trust, never develops a secure base from which to explore the world. They become emotionally isolated, unable to form deep connections even if they wanted to. Their relationships are transactional, based on utility rather than genuine affection. This emotional isolation is perhaps the most tragic aspect of their situation, a wound that might never truly heal, even if they are eventually rescued. Yet despite all these psychological challenges, some part of the human mind remains intact. Humans are extraordinarily resilient creatures, capable of surviving and even adapting to conditions that would break most other species. The child develops their own unique psychology, shaped by, but not entirely determined by their environment. They find moments of joy, even in this harsh world. They form connections, however limited, with those around them. They develop a sense of purpose and identity, even if that identity is strange and conflicted by human standards. There might even be advantages to the psychological adaptations forced by their environment. They develop mental toughness that few humans raised in normal circumstances could match. They learn to stay calm in violent, chaotic situations. They become extremely observant, reading subtle cues in body language and behavior that others might miss. They develop a kind of street wisdom, an instinctive understanding of power dynamics and social hierarchies. But these advantages come at a terrible cost. The child has sacrificed much of what makes human psychology unique and valuable. Their capacity for abstract thought, for moral reasoning, for empathy and connection. All of these have been stunted or distorted by their environment. They are psychologically more orc than human, thinking in patterns that would seem alien and disturbing to most members of their birth species. Perhaps most disturbing of all is the question of whether this transformation is reversible. Can a human raised among orcs ever truly become human again? Can they unlearn the lessons of violence and dominance that have been so deeply ingrained? Can they recover the emotional capacities that their traumatic upbringing has suppressed? These are questions without easy answers, but they become crucial if our hypothetical child ever encounters other humans again. Which brings us to the next phase of our examination. What happens when this orc-raised human finally comes face to face with the human Imperium? How do they react to meeting people who are biologically like them but culturally alien? And how does the Imperium respond to this strange hybrid creature that is neither proper human nor simple xenos? These scenarios reveal the full extent of the transformation we have been discussing, as the familiar becomes strange and the strange becomes familiar. The moment of first contact between an orc-raised human and Imperial forces is fraught with danger, confusion, and potential tragedy. Imagine the scene from both perspectives. From the Imperial side, perhaps a squad of Astra Militarum soldiers or even space marines conducting a sweep of an area recently cleared of orcs. They encounter what appears to be a human, though one dressed in crude orc garb, painted green, armed with Xenos weapons. The first assumption is likely to be that this is a collaborator, a traitor who has sided with the enemy. The instinct is to shoot first and ask questions later. From the perspective of the orc-raised human, they encounter what they have been taught are weak, cowardly humies. The Imperial forces are wearing uniforms, moving in coordinated formations, following orders from leaders they have not personally challenged and beaten. To someone raised in orc culture, this behavior is incomprehensible and vaguely disgusting. Real warriors should assert dominance through personal combat, not hide behind ranks and discipline. The communication barriers are immediate and severe. The orc-raised human speaks primarily in orc language. They're Gothic if they speak it at all heavily accented and mixed with orcish terms. They might shout challenges in proper orcish fashion, calling the Imperial soldiers cowards and demanding they fight properly. The soldiers, hearing this incomprehensible mix of languages and seeing the Xenos weapons, are even more convinced they face an enemy. If somehow violence is delayed long enough for actual communication to occur, the culture clash becomes even more apparent. The orc-raised human does not understand Imperial customs, does not show proper respect for rank or authority, might even attempt to assert dominance through physical intimidation, the only method they know. They do not understand why the soldiers won't just fight them directly to establish who is in charge. The Imperial forces, for their part, are deeply disturbed by what they see. This person looks human, but acts like an orc. They show no loyalty to the Emperor, no understanding of Imperial culture, no evidence of proper human thinking. The religious officials accompanying the force, whether ecclesiarchy priests or space marine chaplains, would likely declare this person corrupted beyond redemption, a heretic who has embraced Xenos ways. There are several possible outcomes to such an encounter, none of them good for the orc-raised human. The most likely is immediate execution. The Imperium does not have a rehabilitation program for humans who have become culturally orcish. The Inquisition's attitude towards such cases would be summary, execution followed by thorough examination of the body to ensure no further corruption has occurred. The person is simply too dangerous, too unpredictable, too alien in thought and action to be allowed to live. If execution is somehow delayed, perhaps because someone in the Imperial force recognizes the value of interrogation, the orc-raised human might be taken prisoner. This experience would be deeply confusing and traumatic for them. Imprisonment makes no sense from an orcish perspective. If you are captured by enemies, they either use you as a slave, which involves putting you to work, or they kill you. This business of locking someone in a cell and asking them questions seems both cruel and pointless. The interrogation process would be mutually frustrating. The interrogators want information about orc positions, plans, capabilities. But the orc-raised human thinks like an orc, which means they don't really understand long-term planning or strategic thinking in the Imperial sense. Orcs don't have grand strategies. They have a desire to find the next good fight. The human can tell the interrogators where the orcs are, but not because they are betraying their warband. They simply don't see this information as particularly secret or valuable. The interrogators, meanwhile, are trying to determine if the prisoner is truly human or some kind of hybrid abomination. They ask questions designed to assess humanity. Do you worship the Emperor? Do you know the Imperial Creed? What world were you born on? But the orc-raised human has no satisfactory answers. They might mention Gork and Mork, which immediately marks them as heretics. They cannot recite the creed they have never learned. They might not even remember their birth world if they were captured very young. The prisoner's behavior during interrogation would seem bizarre and disturbing to the interrogators. They show no fear of threats, having been conditioned to violence their entire life. They might try to establish dominance over the interrogators through aggressive posturing and challenges. They do not understand why giving information would be considered betrayal. From their perspective, if the humies are too weak to beat the orcs in a proper fight, they deserve to lose. If the orc-raised human somehow survives interrogation and execution, they might be sent to a facility for evaluation or attempted rehabilitation. This is where the full extent of their transformation becomes apparent. They cannot adjust to Imperial life. The rules make no sense to them. The social hierarchies based on birth and position, rather than personal compatibility, seem arbitrary and wrong. The religious services celebrating the Emperor feel alien compared to the straightforward worship of Gork and Mork, and simple daily activities become challenges. Eating at set mealtimes in a cafeteria, wearing provided clothing, following schedules, all of these basic aspects of institutional life conflict with the chaotic, ad hoc lifestyle they are accustomed to. They might refuse to cooperate, not out of malice, but simple incomprehension of why these rules exist. The ecclesiarchy officials assigned to restore their faith would face an insurmountable challenge. How do you teach the Imperial Creed to someone whose entire worldview is fundamentally orcish? How do you explain concepts like duty, sacrifice, and service to the Emperor to someone who has only ever understood personal dominance and strength? How do you undo years of psychological conditioning reinforced by constant cultural immersion? Some officials might try forceful methods. Punishment for non-compliance, physical coercion to force participation in Imperial rituals. But this would backfire spectacularly. The orc-raised human, accustomed to violence, would simply see this as confirmation that might makes right. They would not learn submission. They would learn that the Imperium is weak for needing to rely on restraints and guards rather than winning through direct combat. The psychiatric and psychological evaluation would reveal the extent of the damage. The individual shows signs of severe trauma, yes, but trauma that has been integrated into a functional, if alien, worldview. They have no PTSD in the conventional sense because they do not view their experiences as traumatic. They show no remorse for acts of violence because they have been taught that violence is good and proper. They exhibit no loyalty to humanity because they have no meaningful concept of human identity separate from Ork cultural identity. From a clinical perspective, they might be diagnosed with any number of conditions: attachment disorders, moral dysfunction, identity disturbance, cultural dysphoria. But these diagnoses, developed to understand humans raised in human contexts, do not quite fit someone whose entire development occurred in an alien cultural framework. They are not mentally ill so much as culturally alien, their psychology shaped by a non-human template. The tragedy of this situation is that there is no good solution. The individual cannot be safely reintegrated into imperial society. They do not want to be reintegrated, as they identify more with Orks than with humans. They pose a potential security risk. Having knowledge of imperial military tactics and capabilities combined with sympathy for the enemy, they represent a form of corruption that the Imperium cannot tolerate, a living example of what happens when humans abandon their birthright and embrace Xenos ways. The most likely final outcome is execution, carried out with greater or lesser degrees of mercy depending on who makes the decision. The person is deemed corrupted beyond redemption, a casualty not of Ork bullets, but of Ork culture. Their death is recorded as a regrettable but necessary act, another tragedy in the endless war of the 41st millennium. But imagine if somehow, impossibly, they were allowed to live. Perhaps a radical inquisitor decides to use them as an agent, someone who can move in both human and Ork spaces. Perhaps they are simply abandoned somewhere, left to survive on their own. What kind of life could such a person lead? They are trapped between worlds, belonging fully to neither. Among humans, they are viewed with suspicion and disgust, their Orkish mannerisms and beliefs marking them as other, as corrupted, as dangerous. Among Orks, they are still just a hume, tolerated perhaps, but never truly accepted as one of the mob. They are forever in between, forever other, forever struggling to find a place where they belong. This liminal existence might take various forms. They might become a mercenary, selling their unique skills and knowledge to whoever will pay. Their ability to understand and communicate with Orks makes them valuable to certain parties, even if those parties would never fully trust them. They might join renegade groups, pirates or heretics, who are less concerned with purity and more focused on survival and profit. Or they might return to Ork society, accepting their position as a perpetual outsider, but at least an outsider in a culture they understand. They become something like the Digus Evangelis, humans who have chosen Orks over the Imperium, who have found their identity in that strange space between species and cultures. This choice, if it can be called a choice, represents the complete triumph of nature over nurture, or rather, the triumph of nurture over nature. Their human biology cannot be changed, but everything else about them has been reshaped by their alien upbringing. The most profound realization for such individuals, if they are capable of this kind of reflection, is that they can never go home. Not just because the Imperium would kill them, though that is certainly true, but because home no longer means what it might have meant. They have no memory of human family life, no nostalgia for imperial civilization, no longing for human culture. Their home is among the Orks, in the violence and chaos and crude vitality of greenskin society. Everything else feels wrong, uncomfortable, alien. This is perhaps the ultimate horror of being raised by Orks. Not the physical danger, not the violence, not even the psychological trauma. The real horror is the complete transformation of identity, the rewriting of self so thorough that return becomes impossible. The person who might have been, the human life that could have been lived is erased, replaced by something that is neither human nor orc, but some strange amalgam of both. And yet, there is something darkly fascinating about these individuals. They represent the absolute extreme of human adaptability, our species' terrifying capacity to survive and even thrive in the most hostile environments imaginable. They show that human nature is far more malleable than we might like to believe, that culture and environment can override biology in profound ways. The existence of such individuals, whether they are the Diggers of Angelis or other humans shaped by orc culture, forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about what it means to be human. Is humanity defined by our biology, our DNA, our physical form? Or is it defined by our culture, our beliefs, our way of thinking about the world? If someone is biologically human but culturally orcish, are they human or something else entirely? The Imperium has a clear answer to these questions, even if it is not one based on deep philosophical consideration. To be human is to worship the Emperor, to follow imperial law, to live according to imperial culture. Anything else, regardless of biology, is corruption and heresy deserving of purging. The Imperium cannot and will not acknowledge that human identity might be more complex, more fluid, more contingent on circumstances. But for our orc-raised human, these philosophical questions are irrelevant. They are what they are, shaped by forces beyond their control, living a life that was never supposed to exist. They are a statistical anomaly, a glitch in the great machine of galactic civilization, a person who exists in the cracks between species and cultures, and in the grim darkness of the far future. There is no place for such anomalies except in death. Yet they survive, some of them, against all odds and all reason. They find ways to live in the margins, to carve out existence in the spaces that neither the Imperium nor the Orks fully control. They are, in their own strange way, a testament to human resilience and adaptability. They prove that we can survive anything, even if survival means becoming something that would be unrecognizable to our own kind. This brings us to our final consideration. What do these individuals mean for our understanding of humanity in the Warhammer 40,000 universe? What do they reveal about human nature, about the malleability of identity, about the power of culture to shape consciousness? These are not just academic questions. They go to the heart of what it means to be human in a galaxy where humanity is under constant threat from without and within. The existence of humans raised by orcs forces us to confront several uncomfortable truths about human nature and the Imperium itself. First, it demonstrates that the Imperium's ideological claim to represent inherent human nature is questionable. If humans can be fully integrated into orc culture, can adopt orc beliefs and values, can come to think and feel like orcs, then clearly human nature is not fixed or immutable. We are shaped by our environment and our culture, far more than imperial propaganda would admit. Second, it reveals the arbitrary nature of many imperial values and beliefs. When seen through the eyes of someone raised in orc culture, imperial society appears unnecessarily complex, inefficient, and frankly, cowardly. Why do humans waste time on elaborate hierarchies based on birth rather than strength? Why do they follow leaders who have never proven themselves in personal combat? Why do they pray to a god who demands obedience rather than gods who simply want a good fight? These questions, which would seem absurd or heretical to a properly raised imperial citizen, make perfect sense from an orcish perspective. Third, it highlights the extreme measures the Imperium must take to maintain cultural conformity. The Imperium cannot tolerate the existence of humans who have adopted alien ways, even if those humans pose no actual threat and might even be useful allies. The mere existence of such individuals challenges the ideological foundation of imperial society. The claim that there is one true human nature and one proper way for humans to live. Better to kill them all than to admit that human identity might be more flexible than doctrine allows. Fourth, It demonstrates the cruelty inherent in imperial justice. A human child captured by orcs, subjected to trauma and abuse, forced to adapt to survive, is not seen as a victim deserving of rescue and rehabilitation. They are seen as corrupted, as heretical, as deserving of death. The Imperium has no mercy for those whose circumstances have forced them outside the boundaries of acceptable humanity. There is only punishment, swift and final. But perhaps most disturbing of all, the phenomenon of humans raised by orcs reveals that the Imperium's fears about cultural contamination are not entirely unfounded. Humans can be turned, can adopt Xenos ways, can come to identify more with aliens than with their own species. This is not just theoretical, it has actually happened. The diggers of Angelis are living proof that given the right circumstances, humans will abandon their imperial identity and embrace something fundamentally alien. This reality creates a genuine dilemma for imperial authorities. How do you protect humanity from cultural contamination without becoming totalitarian and cruel? How do you maintain a unified human culture across 1 million worlds without stamping out all diversity and flexibility? The Imperium's answer has been to err on the side of control and conformity, to treat any deviation from orthodoxy as heresy, to kill rather than risk contamination. This approach has kept humanity united, more or less, for 10,000 years. But the cost in human suffering and wasted potential is incalculable. The humans raised by orcs also represent a kind of warning about the fragility of civilization. We like to think that civilization is robust, that our values and beliefs are deeply rooted, that culture is something solid and enduring. But a single human child, isolated from civilization and exposed to alien culture, can lose all of that in a single generation. The thin veneer of civilization that we think of as so important turns out to be remarkably fragile when tested against the raw pressure of survival in a hostile environment. Yet for all the darkness of this scenario, for all its horror and tragedy, there is also something strangely hopeful in it. It shows that humans can survive anything, place a human child in the most hostile environment imaginable. Among brutal Xenos who have no regard for human life, and that child will find a way to survive. They will adapt, they will learn, they will become whatever they need to be to live another day. This is humanity's true strength, not our technology or our armies, but our fundamental adaptability. The orc-raised human is, in a strange way, the ultimate expression of human survival instinct. They have sacrificed everything that makes them culturally human in order to preserve their biological life. They have given up the God Emperor, given up imperial values, given up human identity itself, but they have survived. In the harsh calculus of evolution, survival is the only metric that matters. These individuals, by that measure, are successful humans, even if they are failed imperial citizens. Of course, the Imperium would never acknowledge this. To the Imperium, such individuals are not examples of human strength, but of human weakness, failures who lacked the moral fiber to maintain their humanity in the face of adversity. A proper imperial citizen, the doctrine states, would rather die than embrace Xenos ways. The fact that few, if any, humans would actually make that choice when faced with the real decision, when death is immediate and survival requires adaptation, is conveniently ignored. In the end, the story of humans raised by orcs is a story about the power of culture, the malleability of identity, and the extremes of human adaptability. It is a dark story, full of trauma and violence and loss. But it is also a uniquely human story, for only humans among all the species of the galaxy have this capacity for cultural transformation, this ability to become, in essence, something other than what they were born to be. These individuals exist in the shadows of the 41st millennium, neither fully human nor fully Xenos, survivors of circumstances that should have killed them, bearers of knowledge and experiences that no one wants to acknowledge. They are the forgotten casualties of humanity's endless war, proof that sometimes the greatest casualties are not those who die, but those who survive at the cost of everything that made them who they were. And so we reach the end of our examination of what it means to be raised by orcs in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. We have seen the process from beginning to end, the capture, the adaptation, the transformation of language and culture, the embrace of violence, the psychological restructuring, and finally, the tragic impossibility of return. We have glimpsed the Digas of Angelis, those humans who have gone all the way down this path and emerged as something neither human nor orc, but somehow both. It is a grim story, as befits the grim darkness of the far future. But it is also a human story, in the deepest sense. It shows us what we are capable of, for better and worse. It reveals that our greatest strength, our adaptability, can also be our greatest vulnerability. And it reminds us that in a galaxy of war and horror, the line between human and xenos, between civilization and barbarism, between who we are and who we might become, is far thinner than we would like to believe. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And in that war, sometimes the greatest losses are not of territory or resources, but of identity itself, of the fundamental sense of who and what we are. The humans raised by orcs have lost that sense, traded it for survival in an environment where such losses were the only currency that mattered. They are, in their own way, as much casualties of the endless war as any soldier who falls in battle. Perhaps even more so, for at least the dead are remembered. These individuals are simply erased, their existence denied, their experiences unacknowledged. But they are out there, somewhere in the vastness of space, human in form, but orcish in spirit, living their strange lives in the margins and shadows. They are a reminder that in the 41st millennium, anything is possible, even the things we most fervently wish were not. They are proof that humanity is not as immutable as we would like to believe, that we are creatures of culture as much as biology, capable of becoming something entirely other than what we were meant to be. And in a universe as vast and uncaring as the one we inhabit, perhaps that flexibility, that terrible, wonderful adaptability, is the only thing that truly matters. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of the strangest and most disturbing scenarios in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. If you enjoyed this exploration of the grim darkness of the far future, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more Warhammer 40K content. Let me know in the comments what other aspects of the lore you would like to see covered. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but there are also stories that need to be told.